Hopefully if you stick with me, by the end of the video you should have some good ideas about how you can try and manage your thoughts more effectively. One of the things to understand when it comes to managing thinking is that everyone struggles at some point with different types of problematic thinking. Pretty much every person will experience some difficulty with managing repetitive or automatic or self-critical thoughts at some point in their life. But it's important to know that one of the most unhelpful things is trying to stop those thoughts or telling yourself that you're a bad person for thinking them. So in this video, I'm going to cover various ways that you can try to manage your thinking without just trying to stop it. In general, there are probably three main ways to do that. But before I go there, I just want to say that none of these strategies will work all the time, and none of them will work for everybody. So it's important to work out what's most helpful for you and to keep practicing some of those things until you really get the hang of trying to let go or to change unhelpful thoughts at certain points in time. But also remember that when you're really struggling, if it's got to a point where you might need professional help, or if you've got a certain type of diagnosis that may well influence that and make it much more difficult to diffuse or to be able to let go or to be able to redirect your thoughts at certain points in time. It's also important to remember that various substances or lack of sleep and relationship problems may amplify the difficulty with letting go of some of those thoughts. So hopefully by the end you should have a good summary of some of the different strategies. Firstly, there's a word that I'd like to mention, and it's rumination. So rumination can be a really problematic process for a number of people, and rumination generally refers to the idea that we might think things in a really repetitive and circular way, and we don't necessarily get to the end of a problem. And when we ruminate, we're not necessarily getting anywhere with that thinking. So one of the important things to try and practice doing is to notice that we might be getting caught up in rumination and just put up a flag and say, I'm now consciously noticing that I'm thinking in that way, and then interrupt that process as often as you can. Because when it's really patterned, it becomes quite difficult to suddenly get yourself out of it. So depending on where you are and depending on what your triggers are, it's important to try and interrupt it no matter what the situation is. So the three main strategies would cover mindfulness approaches, ways of changing the thinking, and also distracting. So between those three areas, most of our strategies would come into those. There's quite a popular technique which is called cognitive diffusion, which really involves being able to let go of the thinking and to observe it as the thoughts are passing through. So in other words, if you're sitting somewhere, could be in your house, could be outside, and thoughts are coming into your mind, it's simply noticing that those thoughts are floating through. And then being able to pause for a moment and acknowledge what you're actually thinking, despite the fact that that isn't very easy and doesn't seem like it would do anything. We're trying to take a different position on the thoughts themselves. So instead of being totally consumed by the thoughts, we're able to just step back, acknowledge, I'm thinking this particular thing about a work problem, and at the moment I'm sitting at the park and I might try and redirect my thoughts to something that I can see in my immediate surroundings. So usually a common theme with diffusion is being able to recognize the thought, number one, and then be able to use the language around observing the thought for what it is, and then finally to redirect your thinking somewhere else. So that constant process of redirecting the thinking then repatterns the ability to defuse from it more regularly and in those moments when you might need to. Secondly, the biggest area in all of this is how to challenge and how to change thoughts. Firstly, when it comes to thinking, it's really important to remember that as human beings, our thoughts are not facts. They are not 100% correct. Reality exists in our head, but the way we think about situations is not necessarily exactly how they are. So coming from that position, it's important to realize that when we see things in our environment, when we experience things, we don't necessarily get the exact picture for what it is. So one of the more simple ways of thinking about this is to check the facts. So one can prompt oneself in our mind to say, have I understood the facts in the situation? What is the evidence suggesting that this situation is what I think it is? And if we don't get it right, then we can reframe. That's the term that we can use to try and change that. And in some schools of thought, we're able to recognize a type of thinking error, which is sometimes called a cognitive distortion. And that distortion allows us to misperceive the situation and then step back from it, ask ourselves what's the evidence, and label the type of distortion so that we can see that there's a pattern in the way that we might be missing things. For example, black and white thinking would be a situation where our thoughts might tend to be all or nothing. So we might see that some elements of a situation are all bad, or in another instance, I'm only filtering out certain elements that make me see this situation in a negative way as opposed to being able to see the whole picture. One of the other really common ones that people seem to know quite well instinctively is called catastrophizing, where we automatically go to the worst case scenario in a particular situation. And that's a really sure way to build anxiety about the situation and to also then not necessarily be able to rationalize that a bad outcome is probably not going to happen. So within that realm, we've got an alternative way of doing that, which is to look at dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinking is slightly different because we're trying to practice noticing a dilemma in a situation. And one of the more simple ways to look at it is to say, what do I need to accept about this situation for what it is because I can't actually change it or it's not within my control? And then what can I change? And often that rationalizing between those two suggests that I have to let go of what I can't actually manage in the situation and surrender to it, which is sometimes very difficult, particularly if it's unpleasant. And then on the flip side, I've got to try and change what I can. And in some instances, that will be changing the way I'm looking at it in itself. So if I'm unable to possibly change what's going on practically, it might be that practicing acceptance would lead me to think this isn't as bad as I thought because what I need to do is let go instead of fighting it, because fighting was actually creating the problem in itself. And there are many different examples of where we can easily get caught up in a tension where we haven't tried to accept it. We've just instantly gone to try and alter it or change it in some way. And the last major domain of strategy would be distraction. So sometimes this is called attentional redeployment, where we're essentially completely changing our attention to something else in our environment so that we're not thinking about whatever the problem is. And all of these things require us to notice and pause and be able to stop and then shift that focus to something else. For example, when we have, if you've ever had difficulty falling asleep at night, then you've got a few options. You can continue thinking about what's really stressful and not be able to get to sleep, or practice noticing that you're finding it difficult to fall asleep. Be really deliberate about redirecting your attention to something that you can feel. And in that instance, it might be that you're paying attention to what you can notice in your bed, lying in your bed, on your bed, feeling the pressure of your body on the mattress, and be able to redirect your attention and your focus into something that is more sensory. Perhaps if it's pleasant enough in your room, if it's nice and quiet, perhaps it's listening to the real subtleties of the sounds that you can hear. Perhaps it's noticing the sensation of the cotton on your fingertips. So there are a lot of different ways of trying to shift your attention. And in some instances that may be using a straight up distraction. And in many ways people are using phones as a systematic distraction from their thinking all the time. Which leads me to present one of the downsides, which is if we constantly use distraction and avoidance as a way of not thinking about problems, then when we take away the distractions, they often amplify and become much worse. Or we haven't necessarily learned to actually sit with them, which would take us back to trying to defuse and notice the thoughts passing through and reduce the judgment with those. So in summary, the main 3 strategies that we can use would be to practice mindfulness and diffusion, to be able to observe the thoughts. It's really important to practice not judging your thoughts. Sometimes it's difficult to not judge, but in the same sense, we can't stop judging, so don't try to stop judging. Just acknowledge that you have judged and then say to yourself, I've noticed that I may have been judging my thinking and I don't need to. And often we would suggest as therapists going back to something like self-compassion to be able to take a more compassionate view with yourself and say, I'm practicing this skill and I'm still finding it difficult, as opposed to I'm so bad at this or I can't do this. And trying to build that sense of self around your own capacity to manage your thinking, to build your self-esteem and your self-worth so that you can actually practice allowing yourself to not get too caught up in whether you're thinking well or not well, or able to do it or not do it. And then moving back to a position which we may call equanimity, which would be to remove the tendency to try and evaluate in general and just practice noticing your experience with more observation. So thank you for staying with me, and I hope some of these tips have been helpful. Managing thinking is one of the most central human dilemmas that we can face, and at times it can be more difficult, and at times it can be relatively easy depending on what we're doing. So try and focus on the positive, but in a really practical way, rather than trying to shift your thinking into something that is not overly helpful to you if you're finding things really difficult. And remember that there is professional help out there. If you do have a diagnosis that might make some of these things much more difficult, allow yourself to have self-compassion with that respect, and that it might be more difficult. But always remember, as a skill, this is inherently worth practicing, because what we think in our minds often defines our reality. So thank you and best wishes, and please subscribe if you found this to be helpful to you. Thanks.